So if you're watching this video and you aren't a furry, congratulations, you've made it to the weird part of the internet. So, what's YIF, and what's a furry? Well, here's a quick rundown. A furry is a person who has a love for anthropomorphic animal characters. Furry can refer to the person themselves or the characters. YIF is basically the furry word for sex. It can refer both to sexual acts with a furry character or depictions of those acts. And just because I know it'll come up in the comments, when I talk about furry sexuality, I'm not talking specifically about people who have sex while in the suits. I think that's actually pretty rare. When I talk about YIF, I'm mostly talking about online roleplay and looking at porn. Now, the furry community is large and diverse. We have people from all ages, ethnicities, and cultures. And as with any group, saying something applies to some doesn't mean it applies to all. Regardless, furries have always been sort of under fire from both mainstream media and the internet in general for being nothing more than a group of sexual deviants. But is that stereotype true? I frequent a lot of furry websites and chat rooms and interact with dozens of furries on a daily basis just from doing YouTube and streaming, and one thing I see people say over and over is that most furries aren't into YIF. That is, there is no sexual component to the furry fandom for most furries. This sentiment is contrary to the opinion held by everyone who isn't a furry. But once again, is it true? Well, I like to start with these sorts of issues by using a little bit of common sense based on what I can observe, and we can see just by a quick search of some of the largest furry websites that nearly all of them allow and contain furry pornography. And we're not even including the sites that are nothing but galleries of furry pornography, which are also very popular places. So what does that say? Well, all it really says is that YIF is common. It doesn't necessarily mean that sexual furries are common. It's possible that a minority of the fandom are responsible for all of this artwork. But is that likely? Not really. It's much more likely that more furries are into YIF than the average furry assumes, but that's just my opinion. So let's look at something a bit more quantifiable. I know, actual research into Kothrik's video, what a shocker. Classora.com is a group that has handed out thousands of surveys across many different furry conventions asking various questions, some of them about sexuality within the fandom. So, what did they find? Furries were asked how important they felt sex within the fandom was to other furries, and as you can see, most believe that sex is of moderate to high importance to most other furries. Now this is contrary to the common narrative I hear that only 5% of furries are into YIF. It seems that most furries are fairly aware that sex is a big part of the community. But results do change a bit when people are asked how important sex was to them personally. It's interesting to compare these two stats. The most noticeable disparity is the amount of furries who said that sex is of almost no importance to them, while at the same time saying that they believe sex was important to other furries. And even though the results do show that a majority of furries don't feel sex is very important to them, nearly 50% still said it was at least moderately important. We can look at another group, the IARP, who similarly collects data on furries. They ask furries about their attitudes toward furry pornography specifically, and the results were actually quite different. Nearly all participants said that they either had mixed feelings or positive feelings toward YIF. They were also asked how they thought other furries felt about pornography, and the results were nearly identical. The only real difference is that it seems females feel less positive toward porn in general, but almost no one said they saw it as completely negative. Participants were also asked what kind of furry art they prefer, and most furries said erotic art. Back in February, I also did a little survey of my own on Twitter. I only received 220 votes, so take that as you will, it's not the best sample size, but of the furries who participated, over 75% said that YIF was at least somewhat important to them. So based on the research that I've done and my own knowledge of the fandom, which I've been part of for about 15 years now, I can say pretty conclusively that most furries are indeed into YIF in some form. The results of the surveys indicate that it's probably between 50 and 75% of the fandom, but frankly I wouldn't be surprised if it was actually higher than that. My personal opinion coming into this was that it was closer to 90%, and this is based on years of interacting with furries. Basically, I can't think of many furries I've met who didn't have erotic art of their characters, or at least wished they did. So why the difference? Why is almost every furry I come across pretty openly sexual, but at the same time, survey suggests at least 25% aren't sexual at all? Well, I won't name any names, but I have come across quite a few furs who deny there's a sexual aspect for them, but once I get to know them, it turns out they have their own secret furry porn stash. There are also those who say honestly that there is no sexual component for them, but there is, and they just kind of don't realize it. I see this a lot with people who have non-explicit but very suggestive art of their character. Either the character has very minimal clothing, or is in a suggestive pose, or involved in some kind of sensual act, or some kind of fetish, but they don't see it as sexual because no genitalia is showing. And this is really up for interpretation of what is sexual and what isn't, but I see those kinds of things as sexual. I don't believe art needs to be explicit or obscene to be sexualized. Along with that, there are some other factors that I've noticed, but I can't really quantify. There are some furries who are too young to really have any kind of sexual feelings, so I'm not sure how many of them were included in those surveys. There also seems to be a bit of a divide in the community between fursuiters and what I'd call internet furs. So for those of you who don't know, not all furries wear fursuits. In fact, I would say that most furries don't have fursuits. This is mostly because of the price. But social anxiety also runs pretty rampant in the furry fandom, so there are those who just don't have a fursuit and don't go to conventions because of that. The reason that you see so many fursuiters at conventions is because those are the type of people who go to conventions. You buy a fursuit to wear it. Then there is the other kind of furry, the internet furs, basically furries who really only express themselves as furries online. Now obviously there is some overlap. There are people who are really active online and also go to conventions and wear fursuits. But what I've noticed is that the fursuiter crowd is typically less sexual than the internet furs. Once again, I have no data to support this, but this is just an observation I've made. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you go out there in public in your fursuit, you don't want a bunch of porn of you floating around. Even though you're behind a mask, you're still out there physically. People recognize you and it could get really awkward. On the other hand, if you're only really online with it, it's completely anonymous. You can easily just create a throwaway character to do sexual stuff with. I mean, you can't create a throwaway fursuit, they're like $2,000. But online you can pay an artist $50 to get a decent piece of artwork, or just steal art like most people do. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised at all if most non-sexual fursuiters had a secret sexual character that they use online. But you know, I don't really blame people for being dishonest or trying to hide their sexuality when it comes to furries. I've talked about it before, furries get a pretty bad rap for some reason. I think it might be because they're associated with bestiality. Now, I've already made a video about this, you can watch it if you want to know why I think it's not bestiality. Anyway, I think it's also just part of internet culture to make fun of furries, and especially sexual furries. I mean, I get hundreds of comments on some of my videos telling me to yiff in hell or just kill myself because I'm a furry. And because of all of that, people want to hide their sexuality or hide that they are furries in the first place. So then you have people trying to fit into the non-sexual side of the fandom by saying they aren't sexual, even though they are. And it's kind of sad to me that people have to feel so guarded about all of this, especially now that gays and transsexuals and all these different sexual identities have become mainstream. We're told by society to respect all of those things, but not when it comes to furries. You want to dress up in a giant penis costume and run around downtown? That's perfectly fine. But how dare you wear a fursuit, you deviant? I've talked about it a lot. I don't think furries are that weird. I mean, obviously I'm biased because I am a furry, but I still feel like I'm pretty honest with myself about these things. Sure, sex with people who have dog faces is kind of weird, but it's just another fetish. You know, putting on a full latex suit is pretty weird, but that's apparently acceptable these days. You can't really help what you like. So why should furries have to hide their sexuality? Why is it so wrong for furries specifically to not be allowed to be sexual? Humans are sexual beings, especially as young adults. I mean, just look at the average demographic for furries. It's something like 16 to 25-year-old males. What do you expect is going to happen? Of course it's going to be sexual. There's one final thing I wanted to say, and that is, just because there is a lot of sex in the furry fandom doesn't mean that it's always about sex. Using myself as an example, the older I get, the less I care about porn and more I just care about having friends and people to chat with. Furries have always been the most accepting, the most understanding, the easiest to approach and befriend people I've ever met. And maybe this is partially because of the sexual aspect. Maybe being prudish and angry about sexuality isn't conducive to forging positive relationships. Maybe the world has something to learn from furries. So once again, it's time for some input from my patrons. Kunix says, the amount of furries who say they're not into furry porn is likely very similar to the amount of regular people who say they're not into regular porn. While some may be telling the truth, the ones that aren't are just trying to defend themselves against the social stigmas attached to being sexually promiscuous. Things are getting better, but sexuality in general is still largely taboo, and that's a shame. If you're not hurting anybody, why is it anyone's business? What gets you off? That's very true. At least in America, people are very judgmental about sexuality. It's probably a holdover from when most of the country was very religious. There's still laws about things that boil down to nothing more than moral crimes. When it comes to porn, you also have to think about how easy it is to have access to it now compared to 30 years ago. Back then, you had to go out of your way to buy a magazine or movie, so it was easy to avoid. Now, you can't avoid it, it's everywhere. If you're active at all on social media, you're going to see either drawn or real porn pretty much every day. So for our generation, porn and sex is normalized, but for our parents' generation and older, the people in charge of things, they still see it as this kind of taboo thing because that's how they were raised. Dododian says, I think it's funny that people can talk about how dank that pussy was that they smashed last night, but furries on the internet talking about their sexual fetishes off to the side where nobody sees them unless looking actively? How dare you? To be honest, I don't want to know about that pussy just as much as you don't want to hear about my fetishes. Yeah, no kidding. Both in the army and at other jobs I worked at, male employees would talk about how much they wanted to have sex with female coworkers or customers or whatever all the time. It was like a contest to spot the hottest woman in sight and make lewd remarks about her. But those same people would shame me when they found out I was a furry, something I mostly kept to myself. Marfelbark says, generally most people hide their sexuality from themselves or others because of an embarrassment or perceived notion that they're doing something wrong or immoral. Most of the people who call themselves furries are in a rather young age group, late teens and early 20s, and haven't matured and outgrown the feelings that everyone of their age group feels about such topics. And personally, the older a furry gets, the more open they are with their sexuality and, furriness, because with age comes experience and understanding and the sense that no one actually cares what you or I do in our bedroom or in front of the computer. And insofar as detractors go, even they have their embarrassing personal demons that they're embarrassed about and wouldn't talk openly of. That's very true. Everyone has secret fetishes, and if you don't, it's probably because you're too young to have developed one yet. You'll get there, trust me. And generally, the older people get, the kinkier they get. So don't ever feel ashamed for realizing that you like something that isn't exactly mainstream, because the people who make fun of you for it are probably only doing that to cover up their own insecurities. Rose says, if you do no harm, help your fellow man, and treat him with genuine kindness and understanding, you are a good person. You have justified your moral character. If you have done all of this and someone else is bothered by what you find sexually interesting, be that cock and balls, snot, human shit, cunt rings, diapers, or vor, so as long as you aren't intentionally sticking it in their face, this is not your problem, it's theirs. Being ashamed of yourself is non-productive. For that reason, I always found furry damage control to be somewhat cringy. I feel you'd get far more respect for standing up for yourself rather than kneeling down and pleading to be seen as normal. Internet crybabies throw around the word degenerate like it means something, but as a furry diaper fag who's perfectly comfortable being abnormal and who treats his fellow man well, I ask, what's your point? So what if I'm a degenerate? It's no skin off my nose. Cheers to ethical degeneracy. Ethical degeneracy. I'm gonna have to write that one down. Like I said many times, you can't help what you like. As long as it's not illegal and not hurting anyone, it shouldn't matter. I also find the idea of furry damage control kind of cringy. It's like, if we keep denying that we have non-mainstream sexuality, then it just stays in the shadows. It stays a weakness, something to be embarrassed about. But if we're honest about it and treat it like it's normal, then it becomes normalized. Then people no longer see it as something you should be ashamed of. At the same time though, you can go too far with it, like wearing fursuits in public places, going to restaurants and Walmart in suit. Even though that's not inherently sexual or bad, it can cause a disturbance and be kind of off-putting to people. That's when you start getting into the territory of pushing it into other people's faces. Like, I wouldn't go into a store dressed in my medieval clothing. I'll save that for the Renaissance fairs. Now before I go, I want to play a little game with you all, the viewers. If you're a furry and there is some kind of sexual component to the fandom for you, why don't you leave a like on this video? And if there is no sexual component at all for you, don't feel bad about leaving a dislike. Remember, likes and dislikes are totally anonymous. I can't tell who did what, so don't be afraid to be honest. Now the results are going to be kind of skewed because non-furries will be voting, but that's okay, it's just for fun. It'll be interesting to see how the results evolve over time. And if you enjoyed this video, why not check out some of my other ones and hit that subscribe button so you know when I post again. Anyway, I'm Cothrix, and you have a wonderful day. Hey everyone, this is just a reminder that I do gameplay streams on Twitch at 9 PM Eastern every weekday. And if you want to get a hold of me, the best way is through Twitter. Finally, I want to thank those of you who support me on Patreon and Twitch. You make all of this possible.